we get started so we can go ahead and get this out of the way. I grew up in a small town in southeast Texas, and I can tell you without any doubt whatsoever, I would not be standing here today if it wasn't for what we're going to talk about today. Now, that's not really my confession. My confession is after I graduated high school and participated in the activities that I participated in, I had a chance to go to college. And I went to a college that's represented by a certain bovine with long extensions going out from each side of its head. So I just want to go ahead and get that out of the way right now so we can get that covered and we can move on and talk about some other things. But my experience in high school as an extracurricular activity participant, and one of the great things that we're going to talk about here, and I'm going to walk you through a lot of different things and then certainly leave some time for y'all at the end to talk about what you want to talk about. But my time in high school as a participant, I grew up in a small town in southeast Texas. Being from a small town, a middle classification at UIL, I did everything. In junior high, I was in the spelling contest that UIL offers. In high school, participated in academic contests, was in the one-act play, marched in the band at state marching band contest one time, and was a participant in multiple athletic activities. To give you a little example of what my talent level was like, I had one of my favorite coaches in high school. Basically, a few years after I got out, I went back to talk to him, and we got to talking about my career in high school, and we were decent. We weren't great in a lot of different things. But his basic comment to me was, Cousins, you were about half of an athlete. And I said, what are you talking about, half of an athlete? He said, well, you played football, you could block, but you couldn't tackle. You played basketball, you could play defense and rebound, but you couldn't shoot. You played baseball, you could hit a little, or you could catch and you could throw, but you couldn't hit a lick. And then when you were a track athlete, you were the only person that I've ever seen in my entire career that when you tried to high jump, you actually got shorter. So while that time that I had in participating in high school really gave me a lot of the qualities and the capabilities that I needed once I went to college and had a chance to go there and do the things there, the lessons that I learned, the things that were taught to me by my coaches, by my administrators, by my teachers, by my sponsors. Those are the things we're going to talk a little bit about today. A little bit about some of the things that are going on currently with concussions and steroids and some of the other things that are going on. But first thing I want to do is kind of walk you through a history of what extracurricular activity is, where it came from, how did it get started. If you really go back and research and go way back to the beginning of extracurricular activities, it's really maybe as old as formal education itself. You look back to the Greek ideals of what was going on with their extracurricular activity programs, and surprisingly enough, they knew very little about anatomy or physiology or really what the health benefits of extracurricular activity participation could be. But one of the things that they really saw and one of the things they built into their models of their education program was this idea of education having a purpose beyond just educating the student, but also having some other kind of higher purpose through competition. And the fact that really what they wanted to create were well-rounded, complete individuals through practical experience and competition. And one of the things I think it's interesting to look about is they wanted to talk about how to create that well-rounded person. So in the mornings, they would spend time debating and learning, listening to music and doing all the things and educating, but their afternoons were spent in athletics and in competition. And even looking at some of the writings of Aristotle at the time, he talks a little bit about that when he says we must distinguish the different parts of the soul. The part which has rational principle and the part which has simply the capacity for obeying such a principle. We must distinguish the different parts and aspects of life, action, and leisure, war and peace. Education must regard all the different parts of the soul and the different parts or aspects of life. States in the past, like Sparta, have tended to concentrate only on one aspect of the soul and one aspect of life. States, however, like individuals, should devote themselves in the main to the aspect of life which is concerned with peace and leisure. So even as far back as the earliest times in education, you can see that there was an interest in extracurricular activities and how those kind of things would go. After that point, and there really wasn't a lot of other people that felt that way at that time, and through a lot of the ensuing centuries, physical activity, physical education programs as part of education was really almost non-existent. The power of the church in Europe during that time really kept the focus of education on developing religious leaders. We'll talk a little bit later about how the Puritans looked at play and leisure as a sin, and how they tried to limit those kind of things. But ultimately, after a couple of hundred years, you get into the Renaissance period and the Enlightenment period back through the 14th and the 17th centuries. People like John Locke saw the benefits of that type of participation. He described a happy state in life in terms of a sound mind in a sound body. And he specifically pointed to swimming as an activity that ought to be taught to all children, saying, "'Tis that saves many a man's life." And the Romans thought it so necessary that they ranked it with letters, as it was common phrase to mark one ill-educated and good for nothing, that he had neither learned to read nor swim. So as you see, you went through the Greeks that really thought it was important, to a time where it was kind of pushed to the back, now to a time where it starts to come into the forefront again. And Locke really wasn't the only one during that time that had that idea and really looked at those types of things. There was another philosopher back then during the 17th and 18th centuries named Rousseau, and he talked about having gymnastics, exercise, and games with outdoor activities should be a part of every physical education program that they put together. And then ultimately in the 1700s, one of the first schools in Germany ever was opened, and it was one of the first to make gymnastics and other physical education activities a part of the school curriculum. Granted, others didn't necessarily follow through with those types of things, and the experiment in Germany with physical education as part of the school curriculum really didn't last very long after that. But you jump to the United States. And what physical education in America really began during its infancy, during the 18th century. Two of the biggest proponents early on of physical education in schools were Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. Benjamin Franklin really thought a lot of that physical education part of the program, and he was one of the first ones to really be an advocate for physical education activities, and he recommended that those activities be not only recognized in the schools, but he also wanted to go as far as to offer detailed instructions into how to build those programs into the education. And Thomas Jefferson, when he was working with the University of Virginia, actually had plans for a gymnasium built into the design of the college, and it was one of the first to actually have a gymnasium as part of the original design of the institution of education in and of itself. Those two really were kind of ahead of their time. There wasn't a lot of others at the time that really felt the same way about the physical education program being part of the curriculum of the school. And so actually it lagged a little bit more after that and really didn't proceed as much through the rest of that time period during the 18th century. Also, during this time, it should be noted that, as it was in a lot of cases, physical activity for girls was really restricted, period. It felt like that there really wasn't something they would need. But in those schools where girls were educated in girls' schools, there was at the time programs that were specifically designed and included advertisements for dance and other activities. So it is sure that even at that time for girls' schools, there were some institutions that offered some physical activity for those girls as part of their education program at that time as well. Certainly moving through the rest of the 19th century and 18th century, one of the things that really delayed the development of the education and physical activity program during that time, of course, was the Civil War. When the Civil War happened, they spent all their time getting people ready to go into the military and getting ready to fight, and really didn't have time to spend on things such as physical activity and what they were going to do after that. But after the Civil War, going into the 1870s, and then through the last 20 years of the 19th century is really when expansion really started to begin as far as the physical education programs and the things that were going on with those. There were a lot of gymnasiums being built in high schools at that particular time. A new idea of activity programs began to take shape and gain momentum as we started moving into the 20th century. But it really wasn't until the 20th century that the development of those activity programs really began to take part. And even then, even though it was gaining in popularity, there were still people that were opponents of having the leisure time as part of education. A lot of times what they would say is that they regarded activities as an interference with what the true nature of school was supposed to be. But as you rolled through a little bit more and got into the early 20th century, one of the things I think that really helped the development of physical activity programs in schools at that time was more into what was called some of the other things. But one of the most important probably was when they released, I think it was around 1918 or somewhere around there, they released the 7 cardinal principles of education. And I think in a lot of ways, and a lot of people that go back and research it think that that really was one of the most important developments when it comes to the increase and the importance of physical activity programs in schools is the 7 cardinal principles of education, because there were a number of those that dealt specifically with things that physical activity was directly related to. One of the cardinal principles was health. They encouraged secondary schools to encourage their students to have good health habits, give health instruction, and provide for physical activities. One of the other parts of the 7 principles, cardinal principles of education, was that they wanted to basically it was called worthy home membership. So basically what they wanted was calls for the development of those qualities that make an individual a worthy member of a family. Certainly the things that you guys learned as participants in extracurricular activities, I think certainly helped you in your relationships and the things that you do with your families. Civic education was one of the cardinal principles of education. Students should gain knowledge of social organizations and a commitment to civic morality. Diversity and cooperation should be paramount. You don't find much more diversity and cooperation than you do on a playing field or in a gymnasium. Democratic organization of the school and classroom, as well as group problem solving, are the methods that the principle of civic education should be taught through. I don't think there are many more group problem-solving methods than you guys that participated as part of a team. Everything that you did revolved around working as a group to solve whatever problem that you may have had. Worthy use of leisure was another one of the cardinal principles of education. The idea behind this was that education should give students the skills to enrich their body, mind, spirit, and personality in his or her leisure. The school should also provide appropriate recreation. And then the last one, and I think one of the most important that you learn as a participant in extracurricular activities in general, is that of ethical character. Involves instilling in the student the notion of personal responsibility and initiative. I don't know about you guys, but the coaches that I worked with and the sponsors that I worked with, that was one of the main things that they discussed and talked about was your character, the things that you do. And I think it's interesting, one of the things that I've looked at and learned in my time moving through the ranks at UIL and as a college student, John Wooden, great basketball coach, at UCLA, wrote a book, and everybody's familiar with his pyramid of success and all the different things. But one of the things that I like that he says is about character. And what he says, be more aware of your character than your reputation. Because your character is who you really are, while your reputation is only what others think you are. So this idea of ethical conduct and being character is directly a part of what we do in extracurricular activities and what we try to teach the students that participate in UIL and in all of our different activities. As the 1900s continued to go, we continued to grow, and I'm going to skip through some of this stuff because we're going to cover it as part of a little section I'm going to do on UIL. But of course, with growth came concerns. My boss tells a thing about chocolate cake, and one of the things that we talk about is that overemphasis on extracurricular activities, overemphasis on athletics can certainly cause a problem. Too much of anything can still be bad. And what my boss likes to talk about is that he loves chocolate cake. It's one of his favorite desserts, but he doesn't want to eat it every meal of every day. So too much of even a good thing is something you always still need to be concerned about. So that was one of the things that we saw growing in the extracurricular activity programs as we went through the rest of the 20th century in the 1900s. And along with that growth really came some concerns. And some of those concerns were specifically about the overemphasis on extracurricular activities. And specifically, Texas was a grand example in a lot of places of some of the issues that this overemphasis on extracurricular activities could have and it could take, and some of the concerns that it would be. So I'm going to talk to you now and go back a little bit to the beginning of the 1900s and talk about UIL as a whole. I know a lot of people raised their hands when you asked earlier if you participated in UIL athletic activities. How many of you participated in non-athletic UIL activities? How many people were in academic competition, marched in the band, were in the one-act play? As hard as it is to believe, we actually have more contests and non-athletic activities in UIL than we do in athletic activities. One of the reasons is how we started. It goes back all the way to actually 1909 when the first idea for an interscholastic league came. Again, we're talking about that university down the street. But what happened was they were looking for a way to increase their visibility and assistance to the public schools of Texas. And the president of the university had one of his assistants go out across the state and ask people in the schools, what can we do to help you? What can we do to be of an assistance as an institution of higher education? And what he got back is, what we are lacking is the opportunity for our students to compete against each other. So he directed one of his assistants to put together a debating contest. And so in 1910, that's actually what UIL began as. It began as a declamation league. And they offered a state debate contest in 1910 for high school students to come to the University of Texas campus to participate in a debate contest. The next year, the University of Texas put on an interscholastic track meet. Then they thought, well, you know, we're kind of duplicating here. We've got a league put together to run the debate contest. We've got a league put together to run the track meet. We're duplicating efforts. Why don't we just put these two together and form one association for extracurricular activities in Texas? That's how the UIL was born. We were born in 1910 as a debate league, and still today, more than 102 years later, believe it or not, we're still a part of the University of Texas. We're the only state association in the nation that's directly affiliated with an institution of higher education. We started that way. One of the interesting things, and I'll talk about that and how it got going in a minute, but over the next couple of years after 1910 and really getting into 1920 and 1930, the growth of the league at that time just really exploded. One of the interesting things about participation is as early as 1914, activities and athletics were fully open to girls to participate equally with boys as early as 1914, where in a lot of places that still wasn't the case. And we had competition, again, for public elementary, junior high, and high school students in academics, music, drama, and athletics. Even then, we had all those activities. Now, we have all those activities and even more. And just as an aside, I don't know if you'll ever have the opportunity to do this. One of the favorite things that I've ever done in my entire career at UIL was about 10 years ago. I had an opportunity to go see an elementary storytelling contest. And so for 3rd and 4th grade kids, we have contests, and they just do it at their local school. But basically what the whole premise of the contest is you take a group of 3rd graders, 9, 10-year-old kids, and you put them in a room with a proctor. And basically what the proctor does is tell the kids a story. The contest then is for those students that heard the story to go into a different room with a proctor and retell the same story that they had just heard about 10 minutes ago. The imagination of the students in this state, certainly anybody that knew the story that was told in the first room, that walked over and listened to those kids tell the story in the second room, there was no way those people were in the same place. But man, what an interesting thing those 9 and 10-year-old kids can come up with. So if you ever get the opportunity, I highly recommend taking in an elementary storytelling contest. The history of UIL basically is broken down for our purposes, and you can even look at a book we put out on our 75th anniversary. We broke down the UIL total into 3 sections: the early years, the beta check years, and then the UIL today. Roy Bedichek began his career at the University of Texas. He graduated in 1903, but then basically for the next 15 years, he just wandered the world. He was a naturalist. He wrote many books about, he was really into nature and birds and all the different things out there. But he was definitely what a lot of people would call a Renaissance man. After he graduated, he spent 15 years just roaming around different places in the country, learning things and picking up ideas and just basically living and moving all over the place. He washed dishes in a Chinese cafe in New York. He walked all over England, France, and Germany. He dug coal mines. He explored rivers in West Virginia, and he worked in a Chicago slaughterhouse. He homesteaded in Oklahoma, and he eventually returned to UT to work for the person that had actually began the University Interscholastic League. And in 1920, he became the director and was the director of UIL for the next 27 years. It was during that time that our participation and number of activities just exploded. Bedichek and the things that he liked to do, he was really one of the kind of guys that really liked to study and learn ideas from other people. But one of the things that he really valued was the value of competition in school. He transformed us from a simple set of contests into a genuine learning experience with that higher purpose of education through competition that we talked about earlier that was really important to the Greeks. He believed that the Greeks provided that best schooling because they strove to create the well-rounded, complete individuals that we talked about earlier. But he envisioned our contests not just as simple entertainment, but as a way to mold youth and to make them better. With his competition, one of the things that he liked to say is that it is this universal enthusiasm for superior performance that induces the effort necessary to elevate new standards, to set new records in every field, serious or frivolous, which may engage the interest and energies of man. He basically wanted anybody that had something that they wanted to do to have an opportunity to do it and to do it well. While he didn't care much for athletics in general, they tell a story. He had a house not far from the stadium there in Austin, and he never went to a game. And they tell the story that on Saturdays when they were playing football at the stadium, he used to work in his garden with headphones on because he didn't want to hear all the noise that came from the stadium that was near his house. Even though he wasn't a big fan of athletics, he gave equal respect to all of the divisions of UIL and demanded that everybody obey the rules. Anybody that knows a little bit about history in UIL in Texas knows that football is important. There's no doubt about it. One of the interesting things about UIL is when we first started back in 1910, football wasn't one of our activities. Track was the only activity. And the reason why is that the football schools didn't want to follow the rules. They were outlaws. They just wanted to play and have anybody that they wanted to be eligible and play anybody that showed up at the school. And there were a number of years where UIL tried to take control over football but ultimately just wasn't able to do it. Bedichek really changed that. He strove to improve the athletic contests, and he was one of the first that really wanted to strictly enforce the rules, assess penalties for infractions, and the big thing he wanted to do is he slowly reined in football, which had refused to follow the rules and do the things that he wanted to. He required athletes to prove their eligibility. Does that sound familiar to anybody? And expanded the power of the league to suspend schools that are in violation of rules. He greatly increased the number of academic contests and concentrated on granting the participation of all schools from the smallest rural towns to large metropolitan areas. We gained control of the music competitions, which we have the largest music competitions in the nation. But one of the most important things I believe that he did is he the one that instituted the process that we still follow today. Our schools are the ones that make the rules for UIL. The Legislative Council is the group of school superintendents that make the rules. I've been at UIL now for 15, 16 years or more. In all that time, I've never had the opportunity to make a rule. We have a group of school superintendents that are brought together, that are elected by their peers. They are the ones that have the opportunity to put the rules in place. One of the interesting things about it is we've got probably two of the most restrictive rules in Texas than anywhere else in the nation. The first rule that we've got is really restrictive is what we call our full-time employee rule. We require that coaches of our athletic programs be full-time employees of the school district to be eligible to coach. In a lot of other states, that's not the case. If you can work at the gas station during the day and come out and coach the football team in the afternoon. That doesn't happen here. We require that our coaches be full-time employees of the school district. But the second rule, and one of the ones that I think is most important for our activities to keep the level that they are, is we've got the parent residence requirement. How many of y'all moved when you were in high school from one school to another? There was a long time that if you did that, you were ineligible for a year, period. If you moved at any point during your career, regardless of whether your family got a new job or whatever the situation was, if you moved, you had to sit for a year. Ultimately, that rule softened a little bit, but we still had the parent residence rule that basically says that you're eligible wherever your mom and dad live. That's where if you go to school where your mom and dad lives, generally that's where you're eligible to participate. We're one of the last states that has a rule like that. There was a kid a couple of years ago in a northern state that won 4 state golf championships in a row, which is an unbelievable feat. You know what's even more unbelievable? They did it at 4 different schools. Because they just had a transfer policy that wherever you showed up that year is where you were eligible to participate. One of the things that I think that makes our programs great is the fact that our kids represent the communities that they live in. It's why when you play a volleyball game or a football game, there's lots of people in the stands. You go to other states where the rules aren't the same, even at state championship games, they may have 1,500, 2,000 people. Where at one of our state championship games, we may have 35 or 40,000. That's part of the reason why is that our schools make those rules and have the opportunity to put those things in place. But as we talked about a little bit earlier, anytime you do too much of something, you can have some issues. And ultimately, there was a report that was released, and it was up there just a second ago. A Nation at Risk came out in 1983. And basically what it said is that schools had lost sight of what their actual purpose was. That there was way too much focus on extracurricular activities. And I think they put together in Texas, and we were one of the first ones to take action as a result of that, with this select committee on public education that was chaired by Ross Perot. It's the group that put out House Bill 72. 9 out of 10 people have no clue what House Bill 72 means, but if you say no pass, no play, everybody knows what you're talking about. No pass, no play came about in part of House Bill 72 in 1984. And one of the reasons was, and I remember everybody telling the story about Ross Perot. He carried around a chicken with him at all those hearings that he went to. And basically what it was is an example of some of the overemphasis on extracurricular activities, because he was talking about students that participated in ag, showing chickens, missing like 50 days of school to go show their chickens at ag shows. And all those things that were over and above what should have been happening are some of the things that led to the strict rules that we have on academic eligibility now. In UIL, we're one of the most strict states at Texas with no pass, no play and academic eligibility. And it's a lot of ways because of some of the overemphasis on things that happen. But when no pass, no play first came out back in the 80s, and a lot of you guys don't have any experience with this, if you failed, you were out 6 weeks. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. And not only could you not play, you could not practice with the team either. For a lot of folks, if you failed one time, you missed an entire season's participation, especially if it was a football player. So that's what caused a lot of the concern when the law and the rule first came out. Subsequently, after hearing all the different things that go along and the concerns that were raised, there were some amendments passed to that back in 1995, which are probably the rules that a lot of you participated under in high school. You still had to pass all your classes, but there were a couple of exceptions. Number one, you didn't have to pass your honors classes, AP classes or pre-AP classes. The secondly is that the ineligibility period dropped from 6 weeks to 3. And you were able to practice during your ineligibility period, which I think in a lot of ways made it better for students and kept them around the team. One of the things that have happened over that time, what we are today, is we're about mostly equality and competition. We try to make sure that the rules that are put in place have a level playing field for all the different students and schools that are participating. We're one of the largest associations of its kind in the nation. And probably one of the biggest things that we do is every 2 years we do reclassification and realignment. It's something I've dealt with on a number of occasions, probably within the last time that I've been at UIL. We've really had a lot of changes, but one of the interesting things I see is we've got almost 1,400 high schools that are in the state of Texas that are members of our association. Anybody have a guess as to how many kids in grade 9 through 12 in the biggest school in the state? Over 6,000 students in grades 9 through 12 in the biggest school in the state. The smallest school in the state, 9 kids in grade 9 through 12. One of the interesting things about that school is they signed up for both boys and girls basketball. I'm not quite sure how that's going to work, but we'll find out next year when they actually sign it up. But it is one of the few things that we do that really impacts every single school that's a member of our association. One of the other interesting things that we run into is that the state of Texas is large. It's 260 some odd thousand square miles and is anything but a square. I've told my boss a couple of times if I ever die and get reincarnated, I want to come back as an athletic administrator in the state of Rhode Island. Because I could do reclassification and realignment in Rhode Island. Heck, it's only that big. Yeah, after doing it here a few times, I think I could do that anywhere else. But trying to be equitable in the things that we put together, because certainly equity has to do with health and safety of participants. Because if you're playing against a school that has twice as many students as your school has, certainly there's an opportunity to develop more depth there. And that's one of the things that we always look at when we're trying to put the alignments together. And it comes down to basically 2 issues, equality and equity, or travel and equity. So we can do all the equity that you want, which means we can make sure that you never participate with schools that are a lot bigger than you are. But you know what? You're going to have to drive a long way to get there. Or we can cut down all the travel that you want. We can make it so you don't have to go more than 15 or 20 miles to play a game. But guess what? You're going to play somebody that may be 2 or 3 times your size. So that's what we try to do. Try to balance the travel with the equity. And it's a very difficult thing to do, and it's something that we struggle with on a day-to-day basis. Last thing I want to talk about UIL before we move on and talk about some of the specific health things associated with participation is I think one of the greatest things that we do at UIL. It's called the Texas Interscholastic League Foundation. Is anybody in here on a TILF scholarship? What we do is students that participate in our academic contests, that go to our academic state meet, they have an opportunity to apply for scholarships that are only available to kids that participate in our academic state meet. They aren't available to athletes, regardless of their talent level or how many state championships they win. They're only available for kids that are in our academic state meet. Last year, or every year for the last 6 or 7, we've given out over $1 million in scholarships every year to kids that participate in our academic state meet at some point during their high school career. We've been doing that since about the late 1950s, and only in the last few years have we had an opportunity to get that number up. But one of the things that I like most about those TILF scholarships is one of the requirements is that the student not only have been in our academic state meet, but they're going to college and a university in the state of Texas. So that's one of the great things about that. Everybody always talks about the benefits of participation in extracurricular activities. I am one that is a very big proponent of the benefits of participation in extracurricular activities. You may have saw on the thing, I have a doctorate degree. My dissertation was specifically on this topic, on the fact of measuring the impact, basically, of participation rates in extracurricular activities on various different things. Academic achievement, attendance, dropout, discipline. All these things are interrelated to the health of student participants. Kids that participate in extracurricular activities. The benefits, they help control the weight and lower the risk of becoming obese. Helps build and maintain healthy bones and muscles. Reduces fat and develops efficient function of the heart and lungs. Promotes psychological well-being. Reduces stress, anxiety, and depression. Helps prevent or control risky behaviors like tobacco, alcohol, or other substance abuse, unhealthy diet and violence, and it fosters social connections. Everybody understands that kids that feel safe and protected are going to do better things. They're going to be healthier. We talk about the regular physical activity providing students with substantial physical, mental, and social health benefits. Improvement Involvement in properly guided physical activity can foster the adoption of other healthy behaviors like we talk about up there, with avoiding tobacco and drug use, violent behavior. Team games promote positive social integration and facilitate the development of social skills in children. And one of the great things about that is the patterns of healthy behaviors that kids develop when they're in high school carry over to later in their life. So not only do those benefits really help the student while they're in school, it's something that carries over and follows them throughout their adult life. One of the things that we always talk about, and where schools really have a unique opportunity, is providing those adequate physical activities for young people on an equal basis through compulsory physical education programs as well as through school sport programs. It is one of the most efficient health programs anywhere, is the extracurricular activity program. I was asked, when I did my interview to get the job that I have right now, I was asked, one of the questions I was asked, if I could be king for a day, if I could make any rule in UIL that I wanted to make, what would that rule be? And I thought of all kind of interesting things that I could come up with. But ultimately what I said and what my response was is that I would like to have 100% of students participate in extracurricular activities because of these. The things that you learn about being healthy. The things that you learn about some of the other things I'll talk about here in a minute. One of the things you always hear kids talk about with their coaches is how hard they make them work. And there's a reason why they make them work hard. One of the things about hard work I always think about, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie A League of Their Own about the Women's Professional Baseball League. Toward the end, as they're coming up to the World Series and Gina Davis's husband gets shot and he comes home and she's leaving. She's not going to play anymore. It's right after she had the fight with her sister on the pitcher's mound and they traded her sister and she threw the ball through the window and all that good stuff. And she comes outside the next day and is getting in the car to drive home with her husband. And Tom Hanks comes and asks her, why? What are you doing? Why are you leaving? She said, well, it just got too hard. It got too hard. And what did he say? He said it's supposed to be hard. That if it was easy, everybody would do it. The hard is what makes it good. That's what you learn about health. That's what you learn about participation in high school with the coaches that you work with. Yeah, you work hard, but the benefits that you get out of it, not just for when you're in school, but also for what happens after you get out of school, that's the hard part that makes it good. That's the part of the hard that makes it good. Not only is the benefit of extracurricular activities good for the health of the student, in a lot of ways, it's really good for the health of the school as well. This is one of the areas where my research really focused. Is not necessarily just on the health of the students that participate, and there are plenty of studies and information out there that actually show that. But where my research actually focused was to the health of the school. Academic achievement is something that's really important in schools. And there's a number of studies, and I can go through the numbers all you want to, but I'm just going to point out a couple of studies that I found in my research that I found really interesting. One was done back in 1991 in Casper, Wyoming, and basically it found these things about participation in high school sports. By a 2-to-1 ratio, boys who participate in sports do better in school, do not drop out, and have a better chance to get through college. The ratio for girls who participate and do well is more than 3-to-1. Sports participants take average and above average classes. Sports participants receive above average grades and do above average on skills tests. And student athletes appear to have more parental involvement than other students. Everybody knows how important it is to have your parents involved in education of students all the way through from their young involvement all the way up through high school. But not only is it just about those things, higher GPAs. Students that participate in extracurricular activities do better. There's no doubt about it. All the things are out there. In my research, I had 7 different measures of academic achievement. On 5 of the 7 measures, the higher the participation rates were in extracurricular activities at the school, the higher their academic achievement was. I looked at mean SAT scores, mean ACT scores. And probably one of the most important things for schools in Texas, I looked at passing rates on what was the tax exam at that time. Schools that had higher participation rates in extracurricular activities had higher passing rates on their tax scores at both grade 9, 10, and 11. The only two things where we really didn't find a strong correlation between participation rates and academic achievement were number of advanced classes and number of kids that were on the Distinguished Achievement Graduation Plan. And I think some of that had to do with the fact that kids that are in athletics take athletic classes. They don't necessarily have room in their schedule for the addition of those other courses. But one of the things I find intriguing, especially in this high-stakes testing and school ratings era, is as everybody continues to move more towards standardized testing as an evaluative and assessment tool, the extracurricular guys, people that care about extracurricular activities, can point to these types of academic achievement gains as a justification for having extracurricular participation. So not only do you have the health benefits that come directly to the students that participate, the school gets benefits as well. And it's not just in academic achievement. It's in attendance as well, which is very important in Texas. In case you don't know, you know what a school's funding is mostly tied to in Texas? The number of kids that show up to school. I live in a community a little bit southwest of Austin. Every time a kid misses class or is counted absent at school, it costs the school district $34. They've got a pretty good attendance rate. It's about 96% right now. If they were able to bump that attendance rate up 1%, you know how much money that means for them? $250,000. Just by increasing their attendance rate 1%. You know one of the things that keeps kids going to school? Participation in extracurricular activities. High truancy rates have been associated with a lot of things. Lower self-concepts, lower grade expectations, less parental involvement, lower socioeconomic status, and also lower levels of participation in extracurricular activities. Kids that don't participate don't go to school as much. It's out there. The data's there. There was a study done in Minnesota a number of years ago, back in 2007. They surveyed 300 different Minnesota high schools, and what they showed is that student athletes missed an average of 7.4 days of school a year, compared with 8.8 for kids that did not participate in extracurricular activities. In North Carolina, a similar study showed that the average number of absences were significantly lower for athletes than they were for non-athletes. The number of average days missed by athletes was 6.3 in a 180-day school year, compared to 11.9 for kids that did not participate. The results of the study that I did showed a specific direct relationship between the participation rate in extracurricular activities and the attendance rate. Basically, what it indicated is that as more students get involved in extracurricular activities, your attendance rate at your school goes up. And that can't be more important than it is in a state where your funding is directly tied to your kids that participate or the kids that show up at school. Some other things that are interesting that schools really care about that are directly health related. Dropouts. Back in 2003, they found that there were two important factors in a Department of Education study to the success of any educational system. The rate at which people drop out and the rate at which they complete high school each year. There are a lot of things that impact whether or not kids drop out of school. But one of the things that can be directly related to dropping out of school is having a sense of belonging. Having something that ties you to the school. That's something that's very important. The study that was done in North Carolina that I referenced, it was shown that there is also a dramatic difference in the dropout rate for kids that participate in extracurricular activities. Kids that participated in extracurricular activities, their dropout rate was 0.6%, where the dropout rate for students, for non-athletes, was over 10%. The percentage of graduates was significantly higher for athletes than it was for non-athletes. The graduation rate for athletes in that North Carolina study, 99.4%. Almost 100% of your athletic participants graduated from high school, where the graduation rate for non-participants was only 93.5%. Another example of the importance that extracurricular activities have on the health of the school, but as we've shown, it's the health of the athlete as well. My study was exactly the same. It showed without a doubt that schools that had higher participation rates in extracurricular activities reported significantly lower dropout rates for their students. That's a study that was done in Texas here within the last 10 years. And one of the last things talking about the health of the school is discipline problems. All we hear a discussion of is we got to have safe schools. Schools should be safe, welcoming, and secure places for all students. They've shown that studies have shown that when people feel cared for, attached to their school, and feel like part of the school, they are less likely to engage in violence or involve themselves in disruptive school behavior. That same North Carolina study I talked about, the discipline referrals that were reported by schools, the percentage of those was, again, lower for the athlete group than they were for the non-athlete group. By a range of 33% rate of discipline referrals for athlete, 41 for non-athletes. The data in my study in Texas showed the exact same thing. Schools where participation rates were higher had much lower rates of discipline referrals, which is something, again, that can be directly tied to the lessons that are learned on the field and the court. I don't know about the high school you went to, but the high school I went to, the discipline was done by the coaches. It wasn't done by the assistant principal. If I screwed up in class, well, I take that back. For me, it was done by my mother because she worked in the building straight down the sidewalk from the school that I went to. But for other people, when I screwed up in class, they didn't tell the assistant principal. They told my coach. And I got in a whole lot worse trouble by my coach than I ever would have got into by my assistant principal. And for Texas, that's another thing that I think is really important because, again, we require our coaches to be full-time employees of the school district. Folks, they're on campus every day. You remember, you saw your coach every day. You had an athletic period, even during the off season, where you thought maybe you could get away with some stuff. No. If you screwed up in class, who was the first person to find you when you got to that athletic class? It was your coach. And they fixed that problem. One of the things that a lot of people have talked about lately is the spending on extracurricular activities and the overspending on athletics. If you look at any study out there, the percentage of money that's spent on the extracurricular activity program in any school budget is less than 3% of the overall school budget. But where's the first place they come to cut? When it comes time to make the cuts, they first come to the athletic program. One of the things that they've talked about is moving athletics outside the school day, not having athletic classes during the school day anymore. Number one, I think it's a really bad idea for the health of students because not having that daily physical activity is something that's going to have a negative impact on a population of students that already is at risk for obesity and a number of different things. But secondly, where's the discipline going to come from? You think the assistant principals are busy now? Take the school coaches out of the discipline process every day and see how many kids are sitting in the office waiting to get looked at by an assistant principal. The lessons that are learned on the field and the court directly affect and impact the health of the players and also the health of the school. But folks, it's not just the school and the kids that benefit from extracurricular activity participation. It's society in general. The health of our nation, the health of what we do. At this point, really, there's not a better time to talk about the case for high school activities. I talked about only 1 to 3% of the budget. They are one of the best bargains around. It's in these programs, the ones I talked about, athletics, music, drama, academic competition. That's where kids learn the lessons that complement the academic lessons during in school. What we talk about, what we want to create when I talk to coaches, when I talk to people, when I go around to coaches' meetings and all those kind of things, one of the things that I talk about is the impact not of what they're having on the kids now. We know what that impact is. We've seen it. We've all lived it. But it's the impact that you're going to have on that kid 15, 20, 25 years down the line when you're out of college and you're in the citizenry and you're doing the things that a citizen does. The lessons that you learned here, the lessons that you learned in high school, those are the things that are going to benefit the health of our society. More than any other activity, school activities promote and reinforce the principles in our democratic way of life. There's no other single type of activity that brings together people from completely different backgrounds to participate in common, directly or indirectly, as do the sports and other co-curricular activities. These activities are freely chosen by the kids. They're not required to participate like they are in the class. The kids that participate choose to. We always talk about it, and I didn't really get this when I was in high school, but I listen to it now, and I listen to guys that I really respect talk about what they like to call the miracle of the huddle. And it's a football analogy more than it is anything, but if you think about it, it works in any activity. It's basically where people with various differences come together with a common goal that can only be successful if everybody works together and pushes aside your differences and selfish desires. Take football, for example. You got 11 guys on the field. Every one of those 11 people, even if they don't like each other, every one of those 11 people have to work together in order to be successful. Doesn't matter what color you are. Doesn't matter how much money your parents make. Doesn't matter what kind of car you drive. When you get on the field, it's the great equalizer. And everybody has to put aside all those differences and stereotypes and work together in order for that team to be successful. But it's not just a football analogy. Basketball huddles, volleyball huddles, baseball, softball, whatever it is. In a timeout, what does everybody do? They huddle up. Between innings in baseball and softball, what do? You huddle up. Everybody comes together. And it's a miracle a lot of times that we're able to do those kind of things. But those are the kind of things, the things that you learn on your field or on your court that help you move forward and do the things that you do later in your life. Up on this thing, there are some examples of people that participated. Ann Richards, former governor of the state of Texas, was a debate state champion. Barbara Jordan praised the UIL for developing her skill in extemporaneous speaking. And most of you guys don't remember Don Meredith, but for the older guys in the group over here, they'll appreciate this. He once joked that his own experience with extemporaneous speaking helped him when he was working in the Monday Night Football booth with Howard Cosell. And the guy from the Big Bang Theory, Jim Parsons, he was a one-act play participant in Klein, Texas, and credits that participation in extracurricular activities as one of the driving forces for his success as an actor. What a great show that is. One of the things that we always talk about as well, and there is an unhealthy downside to athletics, but one of the things we talk about is, and this is something that we always talk about at the beginning of the year, but it's a great story I like to tell. And it's a story that I learned a long time ago and stole it from somebody, and I like to retell it as many times as I can. And some of you have probably heard it, but it's a story of the lions and the gazelles on the plains of Africa. And there's basically, those guys have one thing in common. Every day when they wake up, the lion and the gazelle both know one thing. The lion knows this, that in order for him to eat that day, and in order for him to survive moving forward, that lion's going to have to be able to outrun at least one of those gazelles so they can catch it. You know what? Those gazelles wake up every morning knowing one thing, that if they're going to make it through the day, they're going to be able to have to outrun the fastest lion. But the interesting thing about that is whether you're a lion or a gazelle, one thing is for sure, when the sun comes up, you better be running, because you're not going to make it through the day unless you are. That's one of the things we're concerned about with extracurricular activities. Yeah, everybody runs, but guys, there can be an unhealthy downside to participation. I talked about the chocolate cake analogy a little bit ago. Overemphasis on anything is bad. We've got excesses in the extracurricular activity program in UIL. People break the rules. It's unfortunate, but it's true. Guys, when we started our organization back in 1910, like I talked about earlier, our rule book was like that big. It was like 4 rules that we had in there. The version that we print now has over 200 pages in it of rules and regulations that schools have to follow. Why is that? Because people try to gain an advantage. Every time you have a rule, somebody's going to push the limit and push the envelope on that rule. And when somebody does that enough, well, the thing we hear is, well, there ought to be a rule against that. And we got lots of rules. We got lots of them. But it comes from the overemphasis on the activity, the overemphasis on winning. Now, don't get me wrong, winning's important. We wouldn't keep score if winning wasn't important. And we've got a lot of rules, to be completely honest with you, that don't make any sense at all. But I don't get an opportunity to make those decisions. I don't get a chance to change the rules just because I don't like them. But one of the things that we always talk about, and one of my favorite sayings in the office, is when somebody talks to us about, man, what a stupid rule that is. You know, sometimes I agree with them. And what I say in our office to my boss and the guys that I work with is this. You know the best way to get rid of that bad rule? The best way to get rid of a bad rule is to enforce it. Tell people about it, make them follow it, and if enough people turn around and say, man, that's the stupidest rule I ever heard, you know what? You're right. Here's our process for how we get it fixed. We're an open organization. We allow anybody to come in and propose a rule change and allow them to do that. Talk specifically now for the last couple of minutes, and I'll leave some questions on some of the issues that we're running into now specifically, concussions and head injuries. This has been an issue for UIL for many years. We were one of the first states in the nation to actually implement a required concussion management protocol for our participants. I believe that was done back in 2005. Recently in the legislature, there was a law passed in reference to concussions. And in general, what that law says, if a student participant is even suspected of having a head injury, they have to be immediately removed from participation in practice or competition until they are evaluated by a physician. And once the physician deems that, in their opinion, that student's ready to go back and participate, then that's when they can begin a return to play protocol. And each school district, we've got over 1,000 of them in the state of Texas, each school district in that law now has to develop their own concussion oversight team, which is a group of physicians and trainers and people in their community that's going to develop their return to play protocol. What science is telling us right now is that basically the best treatment for a concussion is rest. You know how hard it is to get 16 and 17-year-old kids to rest? You know what they tell them? Don't play video games. Don't watch TV. Don't search on the internet. Good luck with that. It's very difficult, but guys, those are the kind of things that are important in getting back from a concussion. Those things delay the return to play. But once there is a clearance for that student to return to play, once they're no longer exhibiting any of the symptoms of a concussion, that's when they start the return to play protocol that their school has put together. What science is telling us now is that a progressive, step-by-step return to play is the best policy. Schools get to make their own decisions, but we've been able to work with a group of different stakeholders, the coaches associations, trainers associations, and have put together a pretty good document that's on our website that provides schools with information that they need to be able to implement this state law. One of the things that I talk to schools and coaches about is how important this is. We find usually that when we pass a rule, it takes about 5 years for people to figure out that we actually passed a rule. And for our rules, really, it's important, but it's not that important. It's not that big a deal. But when you're talking about state law, when you're talking about something about the specific health and safety of participants, it is important that those schools know what's going on and that we do everything that we can to protect the health and safety of their students. Anabolic steroids continues to be an issue. We've been looking at this, again, for a number of years. And basically what we at UIL found is that our school districts are the ones that wanted to be able to make the decision on whether or not, A, if they drug tested their students at the local level, and B, if they decided to, what they wanted to test them for. A few years ago, the legislature had some extra money laying around and decided that they were going to mandate anabolic steroid testing for participants in high school athletics. So in 2007-2008 school year, we started our first year of anabolic steroid testing. Since that school year, we have tested almost 60,000 student athletes at the high school level for steroids and spent probably in excess of $8.5 or $9 million. Anybody know how many students have been popped for anabolic steroid positive tests since 2007, 2008? Less than 30. Less than 30. A lot of people say, well, that's an example of the fact that you're wasting money and you don't need to test. Well, certainly that might be one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is the fact that kids know they might get tested is enough deterrent for them not to use anabolic steroids. I don't know the answer to that question. I know this. One of the difficult things that we saw with the testing program itself is the way that they made us test. If you were a freshman girl golfer, you had the same chance of being picked for an anabolic steroid test as a senior 350-pound offensive lineman on the football team. They literally said, put everybody in a pile and start picking them out. We were able to convince them this last time that let us target test. Let us pick the sports of concern and let us see if that makes any difference. If you look at the actual numbers nationwide, I know there were a couple of kids in Georgia this past year that had an issue. But in Texas, we've actually been extremely lucky when it comes to that. Our numbers of kids that have died of heat-related illnesses over the last 25 or 30 years is really small, less than 5. One of the reasons is because our coaches are professionals. But one of the other reasons is we've got strict rules, at least for about the last 8 years, on how much practice kids are allowed to do outside the school year. Fall practice for volleyball and football are the biggest things that we run into. Football more than that because A, volleyball is usually inside. And number 2, volleyball players, you start practice one day and you scrimmage 2 days later, so you don't have the opportunity to do as much practice. But in football, especially now with the way the legislature has changed the school start date, there are 3 weeks that you can have football practice before school starts. We've got a lot of schools now that are actually playing their first football game before the school year even begins because of the way the legislature has put the rules in. That's a long time for football practice, and anybody that's grown up here knows it's hot in July. It's hot in August. A couple of things that we've done to try to make that a little bit easier. We've allowed now our coaches to do strength and conditioning camps in the summer with our athletes. Probably one of the best changes we made because it allows kids to stay in shape during the summer with their coaches. You can't do any ball skills. You can't do any team drills. Straight strength and conditioning, weights and running. That's helped a lot. The other thing we've done is we put limits on the length of practice. It's what we call the 5-3-2 rule now. In any day you're going to have a practice, you're not going to practice more than 5 hours total. If you have more than one practice in a day, no practice is longer than 3 hours, and you've got to have 2 hours of rest between the end of one practice and the beginning of the next. But probably one of the biggest changes that we've made, and one of the things that caused us a lot of grief over the last couple of months, is we've changed the way we're doing two-a-days in football in the state of Texas. Now, if you have 2 practices on one day, you cannot have but 1 practice on the next. So you're not allowed to have consecutive days of 2-a-day practice anymore. We're going to implement this starting this fall. So it'll be interesting to see how the football coaches and those guys react to that. But I'm going to close with you guys and take some questions the same way that I close with everybody else. And the way I started here today. There's no doubt that I would not be standing here if it wasn't for extracurricular activities. The UIL, I didn't know it at the time. I didn't have any clue what UIL was when I was in high school. I knew I played basketball. I knew I played football. I knew I played baseball. I knew I went to a region in some literary criticism contest, and I remember marching in the state band contest. I didn't have a clue what UIL was. But I knew who my coaches were. I knew who cared about me. And the thing that I talked about a little bit earlier and what I tell coaches every day is nobody's going to care in 15 or 20 years what kind of car you drove, how many games you won, how many championships you have. But what people are going to care about is that you left the places you visited better than they were when they got there. And by teaching students, teaching players about the health, the safety, the benefits of participation, that's where the impact is made. Guys, I'm the luckiest person in the world. I get paid to watch sports. You can't beat it. I don't feel like I've gone to work in as many years as I've been at UIL. This is the only job I've ever had, and it's going to be the only job I ever have if I have anything to do with it. It's because of you. Because of me, what I was, what I did, and what the people that helped me get to where I am did. I wouldn't be standing here if it wasn't for others, and I'm going to do everything I can to help others have the same impact that people had on me. So thank y'all for what you do. If anybody has questions, I'll be happy to stick around. Other than that, again, thank y'all for letting me come and talk.